You know what's even better than drinking a delicious International Delight iced coffee? Winning a brand new car to drink it in. Visit internationaldelightcarsweeps.com for rules and enter through November 10th for your chance to win a new car plus a year's supply of iced coffee. No purchase necessary. Year's worth of product awarded as product and coupons. Valued at $978.20. Open to legal residents of U.S. and D.C., excluding Alaska, Connecticut, New Jersey, Nevada, Hawaii, Tennessee, and Wisconsin, who are at least 18 and age of majority. Ends October 10, 2024. Sponsored by Danone US LLC. For official rules, visit internationaldelightcarsweeps.com.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Welcome to Supernatural Circumstances, the podcast where we take you down the rabbit hole into the fantastic world of the strange, the paranormal, and the unknown. I'm Morgan Knudsen.
And I am Mike Browne. It's time to dim the lights and settle in. Come along with us on this week's adventure. And this week we are talking to Dr. Dean Bertram of Talking Weird, again, and other amazing projects, especially about this one, The Shaver Mystery. I'm so into it now. I can't escape it. I cannot.
Oh, it's so interesting. And I think the fascinating thing to me about The Shaver Mystery is how many people don't know about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a staple for ufology and the paranormal in general, and it seems to have just completely gone by the wayside.
To some people's opinion, I think Dean included, it's where the term flying saucers even came from.
Yeah.
Let's get into this and have a conversation with Dean, and he can explain the Shaver Mystery a little more to us.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Sephora stores are everywhere you are. So just pop in when you need a brown lip to match your 90s playlist. A confidence boost before your interview? Or a last-minute gift for mom's birthday. There's always a Sephora near you. Just pop in. Use our store locator to find your local Sephora or Sephora at Kohl's.
This is great, and what a great story to be talking about today is, of course, the Shaver Mystery. And Dean, we're just so glad to have you back. I mean, it's always a joy to have you on, so thank you for coming.
Well, it's a joy to be able to chat to both you, Morgan and Mike. And of course, any day I get to talk about the Shaver Mystery is a good day.
Yeah.
This is so exciting. This film that you made, I mean, first of all, congratulations. It's been getting airtime at all the festivals and the conferences and has been doing so well. So first, huge congratulations to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's just nice to get it out there. I didn't actually ever plan to do the short because I'm making a feature, which is this kind of a, I guess, cribbed from and designed to be a standalone short. But
Sure.
But I originally just thought I'll do it in front of a test audience where I have a captive audience at a festival I run called Midwest Weird Fest in March. I just wanted to play the segment and see how it played. And it played really well. And then I thought, maybe I should start festivaling this while I'm still finishing the feature. And yeah, it seems to be really well received, which is excellent. I'm glad people are enjoying it. I think that one of the reasons is so few people know about the Shaver Mystery. And it's so important, but it's kind of been forgotten.
Oh, it's hugely important. And the short is so good. I can't wait for you to finish the feature because it's so interesting. How did you come across this? What was your interest in this that got you really hooked into this story?
Yeah, that's a great question. Originally, when I wrote my PhD dissertation on the history of American UFO belief back in the day in Sydney, Australia, I kind of concurred with people like John Keel and the arch skeptic Donald Menzel, and even various FBI documents from back in the 40s. And all of these people essentially said that Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver essentially created modern UFO belief, or they laid the way for it with the Shaver mystery, because the Shaver mystery was kind of proto-UFO belief and was still front and center in the pages of America's most successful science fiction pulp magazine, Amazing Stories, when the flying saucers erupted in the skies of America. And to Palmer and to Shaver, that was justification for the science fiction stories, which they billed as true stories. They'd been running for the last 30-something years in the pages of Amazing. So I was interested in it academically, and I certainly wrote about it to that extent within the pages of my dissertation. But then, in a very strange coincidence, or perhaps more likely what Jung would call a synchronicity, over a decade or two later, I found myself living where I still do live now, in central Wisconsin. And that had nothing to do with what I'm about to say. It wasn't Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver or my interest in them that made me move to the middle of nowhere. But I used to do another show on the Untold Radio Network. I still do a show called Talking Weird, which you've guested on a number of times, Morgan. But I used to do a show with my co-host and good friend Jason McLean called Mysterious Library. And every week we talk about, a paranormal book or a movie or a magazine article. And one week we'd always be, throwing around ideas. I said, hey, let's do the Shaver mystery. I haven't even looked at that for, decades. And so I pulled out all the old Shaver stuff, and I started to listen to an old Long John Nebel radio show, which was archived online. And Long John Nebel was kind of the Art Bell of the 50s into the 60s. He ran a late night talk show out of a major channel radio station, rather, in New York City. And he had all the type of UFO-y weird people on. And this episode, he was talking to Richard Shaver and Ray Palmer. And in one of the type of commercial breaks, I guess, Long John says, and joining us live from Amherst, Wisconsin, we have Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver. And I thought, how far is Amherst from where I live? And I'm kind of still newish to here. I've only been here for a decade, so I vaguely know my surroundings, but I don't know every town in every direction for an hour or something. So I just plugged, Amherst, Wisconsin into Google Maps. And it was like a back road commute from me. It was like less than an hour away in a neighboring county. And this is where these guys both ended up. Shaver moved on later, and that's another story we might get to. But after Ziff Davis, the publishers of Amazing Stories, essentially told Palmer that he couldn't publish the Shaver stories as true fiction anymore for a number of reasons we can also get to. And when they also refused to let Palmer do his all flying saucers issue, which he wanted to do because he'd done an all Shaver mystery issue on the very eve of Kenneth Arnold's sighting, they were also going to move the publishing enterprise from the Midwest. They were based out of Chicago, Ziff Davis moving it to New York, and Palmer didn't want to do any of those things. So he developed an exit strategy. Part of his exit strategy was launching Fate magazine, which is still on the newsstands today, another science fiction magazine called Other Worlds, and also moving with Richard Shaver to rural Wisconsin. And so they both pulled the plug and ejected, and Palmer first started these magazines whilst moonlighting, and he even used a different editorial name so he could keep working for Ziff Davis and not annoy them. And then when he wanted to, he jumped, and he and Shaver both moved to down the road from me, where the mystery kind of continued and went to the next stage as well.
So I'm really curious. For the listeners who aren't familiar with the Shaver mystery, what is it? What is the Shaver mystery?
And who was Richard?
Yes.
It's hard to say where the beginning is for this story, but let's start with Richard Shaver's contact with Ray Palmer. So Ray Palmer is the editor of, again, as I mentioned, Amazing Stories, at the time America's most successful pulp magazine. And Ray Palmer had bought it back from the dead, really. The magazine was essentially failing when it had been bought at a very cheap price, I believe, by the publisher Ziff Davis. And they trusted Ray Palmer, who essentially then was just somebody who ran fanzines and had run a couple of stories in pulp fiction magazines himself. They trusted this guy on recommendation from someone to be the editor. And he drove this failing magazine from a circulation of, I think, something like 20,000 up to about 135,000. But then something happened which drove the circulation even higher. Richard Shaver wrote a letter to Amazing Stories, and I think the winter of 43, 44. And he wrote saying that he had discovered this pre-diluvial language, which essentially was based on the characters of the English alphabet, but that each character had a specific meaning. And so you could deconstruct words by kind of looking at what each letter actually meant. And when it arrived at the Amazing Stories offices, one of Ray Palmer's assistant editors, Howard Browne, who was responsible for the mail, was reading it out to the office and kind of laughing at it and saying, here we have this another crackpot, and scrunched up the paper and threw it in the trash. Ray Palmer was listening, and he walked over to the trash can, fished out the letter, flattened it on Browne's desk, and said, run this whole letter in the next issue. And Browne said, I know you have much more editorial experience than I do, but I'm curious as to why you want to run this crackpot letter. And Palmer said something to the words of, oh, one day you'll see. And they ran the letter, and they were inundated with letters from people who both said it was like just a crackpot letter, and people who were using this kind of language key to decipher modern words. And so it became quite a stir in the letter columns of Amazing. In the meantime, Palmer contacted Shaver, I believe, and said, send me anything else you've got. And Shaver sent Ray Palmer a manuscript called A Warning to Future Man, this 10,000 word manuscript, which essentially lay out an alternative, I guess, cosmology of the universe and the earth, where in pre-diluvial times, there was this ancient race of, I suppose, super beings called the Atlans or the Titans, and they'd kind of made these amazing tunnel world or cavern world under the ground when they realized that the poisons of the sun were aging people prematurely and ultimately killing them. So they all went into the caves, but then eventually they realized the sun's rays were still penetrating into this cavern world beneath the surface of the earth. So most of them fled into deep space in advanced spacecraft where they could escape the poison of the sun's ray. However, the sun's rays. However, the people they left behind, Richard Shaver called abandoned Darrow, and the abandoned Darrow essentially stayed in the caverns and took control of this incredible ancient technology and mech that was left behind by their masters or the ones who had gotten away. And there were two types of abandoned Darrow. There were the Darrow, which using Shaver's alphabet meant they were detrimental robots, and the Terro, which using Shaver's alphabet meant that they were kind of integrative or good robots. And robots didn't mean that they were mechanical robots. It just meant they were driven by those forces. So the detrimental robots were beings who were driven by the desire to hurt and harm and kill and maim, while the Terro, the integrative robots, were driven by a desire to help people and be decent. However, the Darrow were essentially, there were more of them, and the Terro were fighting this never-ending battle to try to beat back the Darrow, and usually failing. The abandoned Darrow who stayed on the surface were essentially us, became essentially humankind. And so beneath the surface were these other advanced races with essentially flying saucer type technology and these machines which they could point rays at the surface and cause all kinds of trouble. They could cause accidents. They could cause planes to crash, cars to crash. They could send messages into your mind. They could read your mind. They could just pester anybody that they wanted to destroy. And sometimes the Darrow would come to the surface and capture people to use as slaves or to use as a food source. So in this letter that Shaver wrote this letter to Palmer, or this manuscript, and Palmer immediately realized the value of it, but he wanted something which would fit more into the pages of Amazing Stories rather than just this kind of thesis. So he reshaped it and crafted it into a story called I Remember Lemuria, a 30,000 word story, which he ran in a 1945 issue of Amazing, with the cover art and with the claim that this was a racial memory story. So Richard Shaver never said it was racial memory, but Palmer knew two things: that when he put Lemuria on the cover of Amazing Stories, it sold really well whenever he used that title. Shaver never called it Lemuria. And when he talked about racial memory, it was kind of hot in New Age circles and it sold as well. And so this thing went crazy. When they ran this story, it was a furor. It drove the sales of Amazing from 135, which Palmer had already got it to up to 185. And by the peak of the Shaver mystery, because Palmer kept pushing this as the major cover stories and the major content of the magazine for the next 2+ years, he got it up to 250,000 circulation. So these stories, although they were kind of written as science fiction, were always said to be based on Richard Shaver's own experiences. And in the second story, after I Remember Lemuria, that Shaver wrote, the second one was called Thought Records of Lemuria. And in that one, Shaver writes an introduction saying, this isn't racial memory. I've had the experiences myself. The things I know from the distant past are because I've been to the caverns and I've been able to plug myself into the thought records they have down there. So then in science fiction fandom, there was this incredible kind of backlash because the fans hated the fact that this I suppose, proto flying saucer, new agey type stuff was being sold in their beloved sci-fi magazine as true. But the general readership loved it. Like it accelerated the sales of amazing stories to its all-time high. So that's kind of the Shaver mystery and Hooray Palmer. And there's more about both of them, but that's kind of the nutshell of their involvement in the Shaver mystery.
Wild. I mean, the story is incredible. He's a really interesting man. And we'll get into that in a little bit, because his history and story is wrought with a lot of issues and tragedy and so on and so forth. But we'll get to that in a sec. The term Darrow and Tarot we have heard before in a prior episode, Mike, of Supernatural Circumstances, which was the Underground Terror, the strange tale of the Cabbagetown Tunnel Monster.
That's right. Yeah.
That came up by a strange fellow who came forward after a creature was sighted in the Toronto tunnels in an area of Toronto called Cabbagetown. A stranger named himself Commander X, that said that Darrow was responsible for the sighting of the Cabbagetown Tunnel Monster here in Toronto. So that sort of came up. Well, I guess within a decent amount of time between the Shaver mystery and the sighting, which is interesting. But
Wow.
So yeah, really interesting. So that this story definitely traveled far and wide. Where do you think he got the idea of these underground aliens? Was there a lead up to this in his life, or did his life just kind of take a sharp turn and this story poured out? What happened?
All of a sudden, underground aliens. Oh,
right?
wow.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a number of, depending how you interpret it, there's a number of different answers to that question, I guess. Certainly there was precedence within both, obviously, mythology, everything from fairy faith and ideas of Hades and, underground realms, through the writing of people like H.P. Lovecraft, the people like A. Merritt. Shaver recognized A. Merritt, who was an influence on Lovecraft as well. In his second story, he said that I'm writing about the same things Merritt wrote about. Merritt wrote about underground civilizations as well. And Shaver went so far as to say Merritt just must have disguised them as fiction as well, because it's what the underground world really is like. Merritt must have had these experiences. Nobody really remembers Merritt anymore, but that back then he was probably more famous and more significant than Lovecraft. So there's that idea that was Shaver influenced by things that he'd read. Ray Palmer, who was obviously perhaps Shaver's greatest champion. And in some ways, they had a contentious relationship at some stages of their relationship, but for most of it, they were very good friends. Shaver suggested that Richard Shaver had these experiences, but for a number of reasons we can get to, we know he couldn't have had some of them physically. But Shaver had been influenced by a number of spiritualists and a number of New Age ideas, particularly a kind of New Age Bible from the 19th century called Owaspi. And Owaspi talked about these different spiritual good and evil creatures and, these kind of cosmic battles between them. And Palmer was quite convinced that, or at least at stages he said he was convinced, that Shaver may have actually been interacting with these creatures. However, to put Shaver's point forward, Shaver refused Palmer's interpretation and refused that he'd ever been influenced by anything. To him, he always, and whether you believe his experiences were physically real or not, Shaver never recanted. To Shaver, this was the guiding force of his life from when he first started hearing the voices in the 30s, all the way up until when he died in 1975 in Summit, Arkansas, where he still had experiences with the Darrow. And the latter part of his life, from about probably the mid to late 50s to 75, he would excavate rocks, which he would slice and do art from, and claim that within them there was secret art and really even photographs, he would say, from these ancient people, that they projected it into the rocks, and he could prove the existence of these pre-deluge civilizations. So Shaver, if he was saying, if you asked him, where did you get this from? He'd say, because I've been to the caverns, I've had the experiences. And he never recanted on that. So it's interesting. Or of course, this is, I guess, the big spoiler, but it's important that we talk about it. Shaver did spend a considerable amount of time in mental institutions with what sounds like it very well may have been a genuine type of psychopathology, likely schizophrenia. And his experiences of feeling that he was having beams projected at his mind and that these group of evil beings were interfering with him with their machinery was not unknown in the history of psychiatry even then. It's something called the influencing machine model. And it's not common, but it's not unknown that people think malicious forces are pointing rays at them and beaming messages into their head and impacting the reality, around them. So Shaver certainly, if you're going to do some type of, psychological or psychiatric diagnostic or, diagnosis on him, he certainly fits within that model as well.
Yeah, and these particular stories about, or maybe in his case, delusions about the underground civilizations. What's interesting about these types of delusions, and what I think is frustrating probably for family members and for psychologists alike, is the fact that nobody can go down there and say they're not there. And it's really kind of a foolproof story in a way, because nobody can go down and check to see if there are aliens down there.
You're right.
We don't know. And so that can be frustrating. The rock photos I want to come back to a little bit, because this was not just a couple of rock photos. This was hundreds and hundreds of these photographs that even his wife was actually bringing him rocks and saying, look at these rocks. So it seemed like there was a lot of enabling going on around his stories and his theories that there were these pictures in these rocks. I was looking at some of your video, Dean, where the one collector that you were fortunate enough to interview was looking at these photographs, and it's very much pareidolia. They were seeing faces, and of course Richard was drawing these faces, based on what he was seeing in these rock formations. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. That collector is Brian Emmerich, who is actually one of the producers of the film. He's the world's major collector and holder of Richard Shaver artwork and ephemera. His collection is just staggering. Like, for me to go there as somebody who'd been interested in years for this to where he holds his collection, it was mind blowing. But yeah, certainly as far as so the rock art, you're right. It was his wife Dorothy who originally down the road from me in Lanark, Wisconsin, which is just kind of the outskirts of Amherst. His wife had picked up some pebbles, not big rocks, which Shaver later got into, just some pebbles, and had said, oh, these have tiny figures and tiny faces in them. And apparently Shaver didn't pay any attention to them at first. He just left them on the desk. But a week or two later, he looked at them, and lo and behold, Shaver could see that there were what he thought were tiny figures and tiny faces in it. So he began, I've spoken to multiple people in Amherst now, including Ray Palmer's son, who knew Richard Shaver, including another man who now lives in Ray Palmer's, the gorgeous house Palmer built there, who also knew Shaver. And Shaver actually worked sometimes when he was down in his luck for this man's family, and clearing rocks, of all things, out of fields. And this is the great irony, perhaps, of the whole Shaver mystery, I guess part two, the rock phogo, that's what he called the art, Shaver called his rock art, is that I only found out this later, but the area where they both bought their farms, Richard Shaver and Ray Palmer as neighbors, is notoriously known in the area to be difficult farming land because there are so many rocks that just keep getting driven up through the soil forever. So farmers have to just continually be picking rocks out of the fields. So Shaver would take on jobs where he would pick rocks out of fields, and the local farmers would just think, this is what I've been told by, first-hand witnesses, would just think it was ludicrous that here's somebody who was so fascinated with these things which annoyed them so much. But sure enough, according to Shaver, he began to find more and more images within these. And you're right, there is clearly that pareidolia type bend to it. But it also, there's something incredible about the artwork that Shaver was able to make from these rocks. So he would, cut these rocks, think he saw things, and then do a very elaborate process of projecting the artwork or the rock slice that he'd cut onto canvas, and then doing various different art techniques, including dropping like glue flakes on it. And apparently he would bang on the floor of his shack sometimes to get the attention of the Darrow to help him with the artwork. And he made these incredible paintings, and he did incredible drawings as well, which have essentially been recognized in the last probably 20 years as incredible outsider art. Like they've had Richard Shaver showings now in major galleries in Los Angeles and New York, which is incredibly ironic because he could hardly get anybody to be vaguely interested in his art when he was alive. But Shaver never presented it just as art. He presented it as somehow justification for something he'd been talking about for decades in the existence of pre-deluge civilization. So I think the artwork aspect of the story is as interesting as the original part of the mystery itself, how this man who had been institutionalized never gave up on what he believed. Like, it's not like he came out of an institution and thought, okay, everything I thought I was mad about. He came out looking for ways to prove it, So I don't know if that answers exactly your question, but I think it gives some more depth to the history of his art and the importance of it to him.
Yeah, no, it does answer the question. And I think it's interesting throughout my years of interviewing people and seeing both sides of the coin of genius many times, is that so many of the people that do have a sort of one foot into the physical world and one in the other, so to speak, it seemed to sort of hover on that line of mental illness. There seems to be a little bit of a parallel there of many people over the years, especially in art. I mean, I'm most of my life is spent with artists and production people and whatever, and every single one of them is slightly off kilter. And usually they're the best people. But it's interesting how, maybe there's something in the mind where it allows you to be just maybe a little bit more open, a little bit more I don't know, receptive to things that people that everyday people can't see. I think there's something to that, because a lot of the people that I know that are have been some of the best mediums in the world, for instance, are just a little cracked on some level.
Well, there's a shamanic aspect to that as well. Once upon a time, people like Shaver might have been the lawmaker of the tribe. Do you know what I mean? He might have been able to elaborate on this incredible cosmology and explain how, the harvest didn't work because the Darrow had zapped it, or, they had a good harvest because the Tarot had helped. So these people used to be able to communicate with the other, and they were revered. Of course, there are lots of people who've been institutionalized in probably the last couple of 100 years, probably less so today. They don't institutionalize people as often. But if you start talking to things that aren't there, once upon a time, that meant you were, one of the blessed or one of the special. But these days, it normally just makes you, be frowned at as a nut, particularly incidentally back then in 30s America and 40s and 50s America, like in Amherst, where they both moved, Palmer and Shaver. It's still a conservative-ish area. It's a lovely area. And it would have been lovely then as well. But again, I've talked to old timers and who've told me that one of the nicknames, which is horrible, that they had for Richard Shaver behind his back was Rock Knudsen. And everybody thought he was mad, because you can't be in, rural 50s America and be talking about, oh, here's my artwork of the cave people, or the caverns, the people giving proof that the people are living in the caverns still. And this is this ancient civilization. And look at what I've painted from this rock. I mean, it just, today, that type of dialogue just sounds insane. And again, I think it's really significant that Shaver never recanted any of these things. You get out of an institution and you're still saying, no, this is real. And he was always insistent it was physically real. To Shaver, this was a physical problem with a physical solution. If I can just get enough people to understand that there are Darrows in the caves, we can fix all of mankind's problems. We can get this technology back, But it's a particularly strange story, and a tragic story, perhaps because of that.
Yeah, I know there was a case recently that I got handed, and it reminds me a little bit of this, and it may possibly be what Richard was experiencing as well. It was a haunting case as usual, and there was clearly something going on at this man's house. There was strange things that were happening. There were witnesses to what was happening. There was something going on at this particular residence, except he ended up picking up a CCTV camera. And for those listening who don't know how CCTV cameras work, these are the black and white security cameras that you often see put up around houses and outside and whatnot. And what they do is people think that they're motion sensitive, and they're not motion sensitive, they're heat sensitive. So they actually pick up on all sorts of crazy things, whether it be triggered by, air currents or, tiny threads or dust, all sorts of things. As long as there's sort of a heat signature, these things will turn on. And he ended up capturing everything that I would expect him to capture with one of these cameras, which was everything from this tiny thread that was kind of blowing along in the natural air current of the house to the dust orbs coming through the walls. And immediately, because he had actual things happening to him, immediately said, this is it. This is the proof. And it discredited everything that he possibly could have come forward with to testify, because it was like, oh, well, we know how that works and we know what this is. So everything else that you must be saying must be wrong. Do you think maybe that might be what happened to Richard as well? Is just that, when he came forward with these rocks, and, to me, it was clearly pareidolia.
Mm-hmm.
Was it a perception problem that he ran into here?
It could be. And interestingly, talking about perceptual problems or the way that artists see the world, a fascinating, I suppose, footnote or postscript to Richard's story is that his daughter, who's now 90, and she appears in the documentary, she's good friends with both Brian Emmerich and Richard Toronto. Richard Toronto is also one of the producers of the film, and he's the major biographer of Richard Shaver and Ray Palmer. And I suggest anybody who listens to this and wants to find out more, they should get Richard Toronto's book, War Over Lemuria, because it's spectacular and it covers all of this in depth. And he has other books as well. He has 2 gorgeous books just on the Rockfogo art filled with big pictures, and another book called Shaverology, the Shaver Mystery Home Companion, which are great. But anyway, the point I was making about Shaver's daughter Evelyn, who's now 90, she never met her father. It's a tragedy as well, except when she was a baby, but she got taken away from him when he was institutionalized, and that's a long story which we won't talk about in full now, because we could talk about that for 10 minutes. But when she got old enough, he'd apparently tried to make contact with her, and the grandparents who took her, not his parents, but his then deceased wife's parents, had kind of done everything they could to keep her away from him. And he'd sent her copies of Amazing Stories and all these kind of things, and went to a school to try to see her, and it was always stopped. Anyway, later in life, she worked out who he was and tried to find him. And by then, he'd passed. She even came to Amherst and visited the Palmers, who still lived there, and went and to see his gravesite in Summit, Arkansas. But she was an artist as well. And the weirdest thing of all is she had no idea of the art that he did, because the art he did wasn't widely circulated. It was very much in small cult circles. Her artwork's very similar. It has large figures, little figures, all these different faces on art. Now it's a slightly different style, but the layouts and the subject matter is so similar. So you have to ask, how on earth is somebody's daughter, who didn't have any contact with her father or his art, becomes an artist in her own right, independently from her father, paints things which look remarkably similar to what her father did? And so is that some biological way that people perceive things and people perceive the world? Maybe Shaver did see the world loaded with images of faces and little people, and maybe that's part of his mental illness, or maybe that's just the way he was wired perceptually. Maybe his daughter is wired the same way. So who knows?
Oh, that's interesting. Mike, what do you think about all this?
I'm trying to wrap my brain around it. This one's a new one to me. But some of the concepts that we're talking about really resonate, as far as talking about psychology and how we dismiss people as crazy when they want to have discussions about something. When I don't want to say that definitely Richard Shaver was talking about something that was real, but perhaps it's something in his psychology that, there's worth looking at, so we can learn something more. Like, what can we learn from this, really?
Yeah. You know what it harkens back to for me is the conversations that we've had about people's perceptions of encounters. Like, Mike, for example, when you were younger and you
Spider-Man eyes.
Yes,
yeah.
the Spider-Man eyes, exactly. And you saw what might have been a gray alien, and and that was how you interpreted at that age, that there was this thing with Spider-Man eyes. And
Right.
it makes me wonder, with so many of these individuals that maybe are stigmatized or labeled with mental illness or anything else, is that they are experiencing something, but then because the label seems out there or strange, or maybe there wasn't a civilization that was
You just write
underground.
them off. Yeah.
Exactly. But maybe he was experiencing something like some sort of psi activity or something like that. I mean, it's so interesting to think about.
Yeah, you can't. I think because he stuck to it so long, there almost seems like it had to be something experiential, right? Whether that was just a psychological issue or whether that was based on something that he experienced in some, at least to the sense that something was exterior to him or something wasn't part of his own psyche. But then you start to feed into obviously more complicated psychological ideas, like, the idea of a collective unconscious, the idea that we're all plugging into these kind of bigger archetypes, and we're all floating on this psychic sea and occasionally bumping into different imagery. And perhaps that's what the Shaver mystery can teach us to a degree as well, that maybe this is somehow how some myth cycles are kind of started. Maybe somebody like Shaver, if they were taken seriously, there could be a whole group, and there really aren't a lot of people who subscribe to, Shaverism anymore. But there were some, there was some back when Amazing Stories was running. They got an awful lot of letters saying, we've seen the Darrow, they've talked to us, we've seen them in the cavern. Like, it was something that started. But maybe this is how some other beliefs have started. Maybe there are individuals who have a better connection with those archetypal models. And then when they explain them to people, they ring true. And then mythologies get built around this one individual's or a group of individuals' archetypal experiences. And I think the reason the Shaver mystery did resonate so hard at the time is it is loaded with a lot of things which other mythologies have. The most obvious, of course, being beings under the ground that mess with us. I mean, that's as old as human history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's so much to this case, and it makes me wonder, had Richard been here today, how this would have been handled. Like, would there have been somebody like Palmer who would have picked these stories up and publicized them? How do you think this would have gone over had he been popular at this day and time?
That's a great question. I've never been asked that before. Well, it's interesting that then he was lucky that he found Ray Palmer, really, because Ray Palmer was obviously an influential science fiction editor, but he was also interested in the Fortean and the weird. There weren't the type of paranormal outlets, at least in broader popular culture back then. Don't forget, Palmer eventually launches Fate magazine a few years after the Shaver mystery starts. Before Fate, there wasn't really any major magazine on the newsstands talking about this stuff. Really, Fate's just Palmer taking all the Fortean stuff out of Amazing Stories and running it, in his own magazine when he leaves. But today, I think, like even what we're doing now, today, if Shaver had wanted to get his message out, there might have been a more receptive subculture in the paranormal that might have been happy to hear it. Like then the subculture of science fiction, which was incredibly small then. When we talk about science fiction fans today, we think of Comic-Con and all these sci-fi conventions and hundreds of thousands or millions of people around the world who are sci-fi fanatics. Back then, people read science fiction like they read Western pulps or detective pulps. But the actual sci-fi community was probably 1,000 or 2,000 people. It was very small, and they were arranged in assorted sci-fi newsletter clubs and fanzine clubs around the country, but they weren't big. And that wasn't really the right place for Shaver anyway. But today, he could be talking at conventions. And we certainly know that there were popular speakers who came out in the 90s, for example, and in the 80s, talking about very similar things, but regarding the modern UFO phenomenon. Of course, Shaver didn't have that term to use when he first started it, but the idea that there were underground bases at Dulce and, the Green Berets were going down there and fighting the Greys, and there was, humans being eaten and experimented on and used as slave labor. All of this stuff was talked about by Shaver first, but he didn't have 100 paranormal conventions around the country that he could visit. There weren't thousands of paranormal podcasts. And, eventually he did the Long John Nebel show, but that was after the Shaver mystery had ceased being published in Amazing Stories. Both him and Palmer were already kind of, going into the background a little bit in rural Amherst. So today, I think if somebody as passionate and as interesting as Shaver came forward, I do think he would find a very specific audience, which was much easier to get a hold of than, having to run a newsletter and post things out to 1,000 subscribers or something.
Yeah. Do you think that that's what's gone on here? Is that, when we initially sort of look at what Shaver was talking about and what he was doing, it's easy to have that knee-jerk reaction of, oh, okay, yeah, that guy's nuts. But when you reframe it and you phrase it as you just did, now we've got shows that are looking at things that are secretly underground, like The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, for instance. Like there's shows and whatnot that are out there that we don't call them Darrows and Taros, but at the same time, like you were saying, that narrative is still there. Has it just evolved? Has what Richard Shaver started just evolve into what we're seeing now on TV and things like that?
Yeah, I really think it did. You're right. We don't have the Darrow and the Tarot anymore, but we have the Greys and the Nordics. We have other really equally, I don't want to be mean to anybody's belief system, but equally difficult to actually believe ideas about these beings engaging with us. So I don't think the Darrow and the Tarot were any more ridiculous than Greys and Nordics, obviously. But I think what happened is that, yes, in the lead up to Flying Saucers, and this is probably an important point to make, the Shaver mystery was so popular. People like John Keel again suggested that when circulation was like 250,000, there were probably a lot more people who were seeing the imagery on the covers and on the back covers. And also magazines get traded, particularly back then, between family members and friends and at doctors' surgeries or wherever, right? So probably the readership at the height wasn't just the circulation of 250,000. It was probably millions of Americans had been exposed to the Shaver mystery. Certainly major magazines like Life and like Harper's also were talking about it and ridiculing it, but it was out there in kind of common parlance. And then in June of 1947, when Palmer had published the all-Shaver mystery issue of Amazing Stories. And most people will say, well, the magazine was already almost the all-Shaver mystery anyway, because it's what Palmer had been focused on for 2 years. But they ran an issue which was actually called that. And every single piece in that magazine was either written by Shaver or written by people talking about Shaverian type phenomena. And that was the June 1947 issue. And in that issue, a famous 14 of the day who regularly wrote for Amazing Stories called Vincent Gaddis wrote a piece called Visitors from the Void. And essentially what that was, before the term flying saucers had been used to mean vehicles from outer space, so he didn't have that term, he was essentially looking at reports of strange things seen in the skies, which he believed were from elsewhere, hence Visitors from the Void. Now, this is on the newsstands in June of 47. It's the June issue. So it had already been on long before Kenneth Arnold was flying his plane near Mount Rainier and saw those 9 crescent-shaped or strange metallic objects flying through the skies, which got rephrased as flying saucers in the press, and then the flying saucer era was born. Now, when that happened, both Palmer and Shaver essentially said, aha, here is the proof of the Darrow and the Tarot. We've been talking that they've got this technology under the earth, and we've been talking about they get visited by people from outer space. This is the proof. So much so that Palmer reached out to Kenneth Arnold and hired Kenneth Arnold very early on to go and investigate another story that fell on Ray Palmer's desk, and that was the Maury Island incident, which is essentially the proto-UFO crash even before Roswell, where basically some men on Puget Sound, which is between Maury Island off the coast of Seattle, were out salvaging logs, and they saw this flying saucer. It was actually a flying donut because it was hollow, spew metal into the harbor and onto their boat, and it killed their dog and it injured one of their sons. And then they packed up some of this material and shipped it to Ray Palmer. And Ray Palmer said, who am I going to get to investigate this? Well, it's obvious. He's quite Barnum-esque, so he understands a good story. If I get Kenneth Arnold, who's currently the hot UFO witness, to go and investigate this is a story. So he hires Kenneth Arnold, and Kenneth Arnold goes to Maury Island. And this is a story where Men in Black come out of, and where the first talk of a UFO kind of cover-up and conspiracy, and 2 Air Force officers die who investigate the story. Anyway, it's a crazy story. But there you see the transformation of the Shaver mystery. And incidentally, one of the men who gathered the materials that sent to Palmer, Fred Chrisman, had also written amazing stories before, and they'd published a letter by him saying he'd fought the Darrows in the caves during World War II. So we're already seeing this transformation of some of the major players of the Shaver mystery into UFO belief. And then Ray Palmer writes the book with Kenneth Arnold called The Coming of the Sources, which is one of the first major UFO books. It's the front cover of the first issue of Fate magazine, which many of your readers are probably, or many of your listeners are probably familiar with. So you literally see these same figures transform their interest into flying saucers. And it's not that Palmer dropped the Shaver mystery altogether, because far from it. And he republished it all later when he was in Amherst in a wonderful 16-volume set called The Hidden World. And in many of his other magazines, he ran stories on it too. But he understood this was the transformation. And Palmer becomes the predominant, I suppose, proponent of flying saucers in American culture at the time. He had the biggest circulated UFO magazine called Flying Saucers. He had Fate magazine where it was frequently on the cover. He just beat the drum for this. And this is what John Keel said again. It was Palmer who beat the drum for flying saucers when it might just have been a silly season headline grabbing kind of story, you know, like a lake monster or something story. Palmer beat the drum so hard and beat the story about things like Men in Black and government cover-ups and all this other stuff, that you really can see the Shaver mystery and the players behind the Shaver mystery move into flying saucer lore and evolve flying saucer lore. And as John Keel said, Ray Palmer was the man who invented flying saucers. And that's the title of my feature documentary, which the Shaver mystery, the short, is taken out of, because there's a very clear line in this kind of movement of belief systems. It's fascinating. I mean, you can tell I'm obsessed with it. It's what I think about every minute of the day almost. It's nutty.
Because it is interesting. And when you get into the psychology of this stuff, and I mean, Mike, you and I, we've talked about this so much, is that there is a running thread. Like, you can find, maybe not necessarily the beginning, but you can at least find close to the evolution of where these things have either come from, and the role that consciousness, our own consciousness, plays in projecting into what we're seeing, how we're interpreting what we're seeing, all of these things. And we share the same passion that you do about this stuff, because it's so wild.
Yeah, and it's important to dissect it just the way that you did. I think one of the problems with a lot of, I mean, I enjoy paranormal films and things like everybody else does, but there's enough stuff about the phenomenon itself. You know, there's enough documentaries about UFOs, and we talk enough about what the phenomenon might or might not be, but there is a lack of at least popular interest, I think, in the cultural background, on picking up that thread and seeing where it runs, which is something I've always been conscious of, I think, ever since I did my dissertation back in the day. But I've tried to carry that through the films as well, because I hope whatever the quality or the entertainment value of these films might or might not be, I hope anybody who watches any of them gets a sense of exactly what you're talking about, in that this isn't something you can just look at a New York Times article in 2017 about a secret, you know, a Department of Defense program and leaked Tic Tac videos and think you've got a handle on what the UFO story is. This is a story that if you don't go back, and I mean, I've just obviously focused on Palmer and Shaver at the moment, but there are other characters as well. I think Palmer and Shaver might be the two most, or certainly two of the most important characters. But if you just pick it up kind of in this kind of postmodern methodology of, well, I can understand anything if I just watch it for 5 minutes. I mean, that's madness. You can't understand the UFO phenomenon by just looking at what, you know, you see on a Tucker Carlson report or on a CNN report or on, you know, a 60-minute special. That's all focused on modern, you know, supposedly, we've talked about disclosure on this show before, and you've been kind enough to have me on. But if you don't ground yourself in the history of what was happening, you know, 80, 90 years ago, you really can't understand what's happening today, because there is a thread which connects all of it. And you have to go back and follow it to get a sense of its real meaning and its real cultural significance.
It's so in-depth. And a lot of these subjects in the world of the paranormal really do go back that far. I was actually consulting on a show recently, and their whole story, when they sent me their take on the story, it was all about spirits getting stuck and they couldn't cross over and all of this silliness. And I had to explain to them that narrative goes back a really long time, right back to the psychiatrist fellow by the name of Carl Wickland, who he interpreted a person's psychological issues as being linked to this certain type of activity, and he has to cure the person by moving to the other side. But there's a name associated with the narrative, and I don't think people realize that. They think that what they're hearing at face value is the truth, and they don't realize that the more you dig, the more you can often find where this stuff has originated and starts from. And then you get the TV shows and stuff like that just grab these things and run with them. And but it's all part of I think the psychology of how we've developed as people, and carrying on folklore as well.
There is the culture today too. I think there is almost, and it's scary to see, there's almost this idea that you shouldn't go out and look into things and research things for yourself. You should just be able to read that New York Times article and think you know what's going on. Do you know what I mean? You should Absolutely. Just be able to watch the nightly news and know what's going on. But all of this, I don't trust anybody to give me the truth. I don't even know what the truth is, but the idea that somehow you can just plug into the current mainstream soundbite, media and have any sense, let alone the sense of something as complicated as you're talking about, like our interaction with the spiritual world, or something as equally bizarre and strange and perhaps, as impactful on what it means to be human as our interaction with non-human beings, whether they're, again, spirits or Dero or Tarot or Greys or Nordics or whatever we're calling them. But to just pull it out of context, a report out of context, a story out of context. And this is a sickness we saw in the UFO hearings that we've talked about. Absolutely. That somehow Congress could get to the bottom of this by interviewing a couple of, a whistleblower and a couple of pilots who'd seen you. It's ludicrous. I mean, it's so much more complicated.
Yeah. Well, we want the TikTok version.
Yeah.
It's true. That is what everybody wants.
It's nuts. And like you were saying, Dean, and I think that's really important to touch on, is that it's become a stigma, as if, oh, you've done your own research, well, therefore it's a stigma. Well, we've got probably the most powerful tool in the world, which is the internet. And we need to use it more often, and have that critical thought and begin to dig into these things and not just accept what we're told on face value. Because like you were saying, what oftentimes what we're being fed with, whatever agenda or story we're being fed, is just that. It's feeding clicks or likes or whichever. And we need to be very, very careful about what we're being sold, because no issue is that simple, really.
It can come down to there are stories that, regardless of where you stand on any issue, whether it's the supernatural or politics or culturally, there are stories which just don't get touched, which are important stories.
Yeah.
And in a way, the Shaver mystery is one of those. It had its run in the sun, and then Ziff Davis decided to cancel it. The two owners of the publishing company that owned Amazing Stories, and Shaver ends up going from a pop cultural phenomenon to dying penniless, 30 years later in Summit, Arkansas. And Palmer kind of fades into, the background as well. But then the Ziff Davis fortune travels higher and higher and higher. And today, as I mentioned at the very end of the short, the Ziff family fortune, and Ziff was the senior partner and the one with slightly more ownership of the company. The Ziff family now are one of America's richest families. They're worth $18.5 billion.
Wow.
So the people who control the narrative are the rich people. The people who had the narrative, like, you can't say this anymore, die in obscurity and poor, So it's like, wow. And whether the Shaver mystery was true or not, it still goes to show how the people with the money and the people who run the media empires control what people do and don't hear.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I mean, and we see it repeated over and over. I mean, even whether it be, like you're saying, politics, the news, paranormal shows, all of that kind of a thing, it just seems like, I don't know. Do you think, just sort of to put a bow on all this, do you think as a whole that area of society has kind of lost its way? Like, that's what it feels to me, is just, I remember a time where, even though things were may have been slightly skewed depending on what you were watching, you could put a little bit of faith into what you were reading and seeing. But I feel like that is long gone. Is that just me?
No, I think we know we've been lied to so frequently by the corporate media that you would be foolish if you thought that was where you should get. I'm not saying don't get any of your news from there and compare it, but would be foolish to go, I trust what, a couple of corporations who own everything want to tell me is the truth. Yeah. And there's also, that sounds conspiratorial, but there is also getting back to ghost shows and UFO shows and the things is people want to be entertained. So it's like, well, do we have time to go into this elaborate story about how Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver had all of these, issues, and Richard Shaver was mentally unwell, and they let's just tell a story. Like, not that anybody does tell a story about the Darrow and the Terror, but if it was around today, it would be like, let's not focus on that. Let's focus on those crazy cave aliens. You know what I mean? Who torture and eat people, because that is what you get on paranormal type programming today. You don't look at it culturally or dissect it psychologically, because you want that fast, fun moving episode, and people want to come home from work and just binge the Netflix before they go back to the cubicle the next day. And so that, unfortunately, seems to be the direction. And sometimes it might be political, and sometimes it might just be because they're serving up the entertainment that they think people want.
The Ghost Bros.
They go, well, I don't know. I completely agree. And I mean, I definitely see it whenever I'm filming TV shows. If I present an explanation, most of the time it ends up on the cutting room floor if if it's not what they want to hear. So, but Dean, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for talking about this, because we want to know about the Shaver mystery, damn it. And we can hear more. Yeah, I damn well know our listeners want to know more about the Shaver mystery. So there's that.
And they can hear more from you on the Talking Weird podcast. Is that every week?
That's live every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Central on the Untold Radio Network. And you can watch that for free on YouTube, or listen to it, or on Facebook or X or Twitter or whatever the devil it's called now, or catch it later on any podcast platform. I would also encourage anybody, again, who is interested in the Shaver mystery, to get some books by Richard Toronto. Start with War Over Lemuria.
That's the one I'm looking at right now.
It's so good. And people who want to see the film, just quickly, this month it's screening, and this month in October, I'll just rattle off some festivals, and people in the area might know them.
Please do.
Sydney Underground Film Festival, Northwest Flying Saucer Film Festival, Film Quest, H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival, Brooklyn Sci-Fi Film Festival, Arizona Underground Film Festival, the Underground Documentary Film Festival, Milwaukee Paracon, where I'll also be presenting it, and I'll be doing a talk afterwards, the Black Sunday Halloween Festival in Essex, and the Fortean Film Festival, which is also in the UK. And that's just the September, October screenings. If they want to find out more about the screenings, they can go to theshavermystery.com. That's theshavermystery.com, and that will just take you to the Facebook page for both the feature and the short. And I always list all the screenings coming up there.
It's so good, guys. You have to see this. This is such an interesting case, and it really does ground a lot of the ufology knowledge and narratives that have been floating around and have been popularized over the years. It really does put some dots together. So I highly, highly recommend going to see it. Dean, thank you so much. This has been great.
Well, thank you. It was a great joy to talk to you, Morgan and Mike, as always. Thanks, guys.
So learning what we have, I've been down the rabbit hole, as I said. I've even bought some books, Shaverology, by this guy named Richard Toronto, who has been collecting stories about this particular thing for some time. And the more I read, the more intrigued I really am, and how much this really parallels what we talk about on this show a lot. It's about consciousness.
Yeah, and just where's that line, right? Mm-hmm. Between to mental illness, what we label as mental illness, versus what people are actually experiencing and having experiences with our different people's brains working in a different way. It harkens back to some research I've actually had to go back on recently by a really interesting fellow, Dr. Morris Friedman, here in Canada, who was doing research on the brain and whether or not the brain, when it's afflicted by Alzheimer's or dementia or a brain injury or anything of the sort, might actually allow people access to different phenomena, almost like if you're taking filters out of a camera. You take the UV filter out, you take the infrared filter out, and all of a sudden you're getting a bigger picture.
Right.
And it was really interesting information and studies, and people can go look that up. It's readily available online. But it kind of makes me wonder with Richard Shaver if something like that might have actually been going on.
Right, because I mean he's spent years in a mental institution, a psychiatric hospital, you would call it today, years, and he was catatonic while he was there. So was he actually experiencing the things that he said he was experiencing? He was just not bodily there at the time. And what it brought to mind, and I mentioned this to you off air, what it brought to mind was Eben Alexander's story about his trip elsewhere when he was in an altered state of mind. And so, bear with me a sec. So what I'm thinking is, if consciousness is, as people are beginning to believe, fundamental and not emergent, it doesn't emerge from our brains, but it's already there, and our brain is just a filter for it. Perhaps when somebody's brain is acting differently, and tuned into something a little differently, doesn't mean we should throw it away. Look at DMT, for example. When people take that particular drug, they all see the same thing, these mechanical aliens. That's not a coincidence, and it's not just a meme that, has been going around. People who don't even know that other people see those things. So we need to really, really have a good look at this one, because maybe Mr. Shaver was actually visiting another place, another dimension, or maybe he was able to, because of the configuration of his brain and the chemical composition of it at the time, maybe there was something else that is going on with him.
Yeah, and it's very possible. I mean, we've seen this type of science evolve over the years, just in the sense of hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations. And for listeners that are unfamiliar with that, it's the state you're in as you're drifting into sleep, which is hypnagogic, and hypnopompic is when you're popping out of sleep. And it used to be thought that the brain is straight up hallucinating everything during those states. That was it. That was sort of the rule of law. And then it was a friend of mine, Dr. Christine Simmons Moore, who actually found out that actually that part of the brain it doesn't seem to be generating hallucinations during that time. There's another part of the brain that's actually active. So now they're beginning to question, well, what is that then that people are seeing when they're coming out of sleep, when they're seeing these strange things and whatnot. So here you've got a number of examples, I think, throughout parapsychology and science, where we're now starting to understand, well, wait a minute, like there's something else that's going on here. So where is that line, between hallucination and something that might actually be real?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we are, this is why I'm exploring things like lucid dreaming as well, and meditative states and all of that kind of stuff. If you really want to go down a rabbit hole, he's been mentioned on the show before. His name is Charles T. Tart.
Absolutely.
And Charles Tart studied consciousness before it was cool. You know what I mean? Like he's
one of the pioneers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
he's an older guy, and he wrote this book called Altered States of Consciousness that I read years and years and years ago, like 30-something years ago. And it's something that I think I need to pick up again, because this is the direction that I think that we're heading with this show, is trying to, hey, wait a minute, there's so many commonalities, and I'm really trying not to have confirmation bias here, trying to sort through, okay, is this just me trying to have some confirmation bias? Well, when things are being confirmed to you over and over and over again, it's hard not to have that, So there is something to it. And the more that I read in this regard, the more that I am beginning to see maybe this is something I'm not saying that we are on to alone, but this is something that us and a lot of other people seem to be sort of tuning into.
It's a pattern. And after a while, you have to begin to just acknowledge patterns. And that's part of what it is you do as a researcher. This is something that we're seeing over and over again. And you're right, it's not just us. There's scientists all over the world that are seeing this exact same pattern and trying to figure this out. And I think it's just a matter of time before people start to come together with these ideas. And it's exciting that we might be a piece of that puzzle.
That leaves us all a bit to think about. Holy smokes.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us on this wacky, eerie, strange, bizarre, out there expedition, dear listeners.
And remember, there is no line between the natural and the supernatural. All is consciousness. Until next time, stay curious, friends.
Supernatural Circumstances is a co-production of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings and Good Egg Studios. This podcast is a part of the Curious Cast podcast network. Theme music by Corey Johnson of Catalyst Records in Edmonton, Alberta.
Every season of Survivor starts the same way. Build the challenges, and we hide the advantages, and then we turn it over to the players.
I am ready to forge my own path.
And no matter how many times we do it, I'm still surprised.
Survivor has evolved all these advantages, all these twists. It has to be victory or glorious death.
That's why we watch, because every season of Survivor is a new adventure.
Survivor. New season Wednesdays on Global. Stream on Stack TV.